Hey, I'm Greg Koukl with Stand to Reason and author of Tactics and The Story of Reality, and you're listening to Watchman Fellowship's Apologetics Profile.
As we heard last week, effective communication is always by design. And as the first century Roman orator Quintilian believed, good communication and good philosophy went hand in hand. Like laws of physics or the moral oughtness woven into our human ontology, there seem to be laws of effective communication that are the same across different times and places and people groups. But if naturalism is true, that is, the belief that nature, the physical universe, is all there is, then there remains no particular way of explaining why everything from stars and galaxies, to our moral natures, to the very way we communicate with one another, seem to have been purposefully designed. Can Darwinian evolution explain why everything appears to us as infused with design and purpose? Atheist and biologist Dr. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Ancestor's Tale, conceded that life on Earth exhibits, quote, amazing diversity, complexity, and a powerful illusion of good design, end quote. A powerful illusion of design? In order to suggest design in nature, one must first assume that there exists a standard of design by which one may assess design in nature in the first place. Natural selection, however, provides no such standard. There is no teleology in nature. There are no plans or purposes inherent in the structures of living things. There is no such thing as progress or improvement in evolution. There are no such things as genetic errors or genetic mutations, unless, of course, one first presupposes a distinctive teleology, a schematic, a blueprint, by which all of nature should adhere. As Dawkins has so famously said elsewhere in his 1995 book River Out of Eden, quote, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music, end quote. Dr. Dawkins has overlooked the fact that in such a blind and pitiless universe, there is also no dancing, there is no music, there is no choreographing of anything. Dawkins cannot have it both ways. You cannot claim the universe has no purpose, that we have no purpose, that there is no evil and no good, but then turn around and morally excoriate religion and a God in whom you do not believe, as Dawkins has done in his landmark book, The God Delusion. But Dawkins' concession of the illusion of design lends itself to exactly what the Apostle Paul proclaims in the opening chapter of the book of Romans, namely that God's invisible attributes are clearly seen through what has been made, so that they are without excuse.
Right or wrong? A moral decision. Like other moral decisions, it will have an effect on other people, make them also choose right from wrong. The Watchman has made his decision.
On part 2 of my discussion with author, apologist, and founder of Stand to Reason, Greg Koukl, we discuss the inherent grounding problem for naturalism as a worldview. As we pick up our conversation, Greg observes how it is important to recognize when a skeptic is building a straw man caricature of the Christian faith and how we might respond. Here once again is Greg Koukl.
during the time when I was not a Christian, I don't know what I was. I had certain convictions about things, but they were not well thought through. And I couldn't say that I had a presupposition as an atheist or anything at all, except for me. I was interested in my own autonomy, which that ain't new, right?
Right.
So sometimes you're going to get people like that are just going around. Other times you get people that are atheists. Okay, this is their strong conviction, but they weren't atheists from the beginning. They became atheists at some point in time, and there was a reason why they became an atheist. A lot of times it was a bad experience with the church, or a tragedy that happened in their life, or something that they thought, how could God allow this kind of tragic evil, etc., etc. So what I'm getting at here is even these atheists that come to our conversations with the presupposition or the point of view, in the beginning were the particles, and we say in the beginning was God. Okay, now what? They adopted that view at some point in their life for some kind of reason. Okay,
yes.
Now they could be disabused of those reasons in principle, in conversation with them about these things. Now, I say in principle because, some people are so hardened with what's going on is not what's going on in the mind. Like, this is a rational conclusion they come to, but rather they're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, Romans chapter 1. Atheists don't like to hear this because they think, well, we've got all these good reasons and stuff like that. But when you listen to the reasons, you realize that in many cases, not everyone, that they're building straw men and knocking down straw men. They are trying to affirm objective morality, and when you see how they ground it, they are grounding it subjectively.
Yes.
They want to be. This is a difference, a change in the last few years. Since the 20th century, the atheists were ready to acknowledge there is no objective morality if there is no God. Now, and I think that follows because alternatives have not worked. Of course, now the atheists want to be moral. And I just heard Michael Shermer just the other night in a discussion with Stephen Meyer talking about Richard Dawkins. Oh, Richard Dawkins is not a relativist, he's an objectivist. Well, they think that objective morality comes from Darwinian evolution. I had a 3-hour debate with Michael Shermer on national radio, and he kept insisting he was an objectivist. Well, where does morality come from? It comes from evolution. That's not an objectivist grounding. That's a relativist grounding, because the morality is inside of us. It isn't out there in the actions themselves. It's a property of subjects. It's not a property of actions. And I mean, he's a smart guy. He's got a PhD.
Yeah.
And so does Richard Dawkins, but they make these kinds of mistakes. So what you're saying is that the God of the Bible comports it in such a way that does not agree with your personal evolution. Yes. Okay, I rest my case. That's subjectivism, not objectivism.
It is
clearly.
Absolutely subjectivism. The problem with an evolution, trying to ground, I think, and I'm not telling you anything you probably don't already know, the idea that I have objective moral framework from an evolutionary schematic of my personhood does not permit me to judge other cultures or other times, because by default, if you are ascribing to a developmental, biological, evolutionary construct of morality that has gradually improved over time, you can't say even 10 years ago that they were wrong. The best you can say is that they were evolving morally, but you can't make an objective judgment about whether or not those people or that action was wrong, because...
Well, you can't actually ever say that your morality is getting better.
Right,
All you
there's
can
no
say
standard.
is that that's correct. And that is a fundamental mistake that people have made. Well, we're more enlightened right now. Wait a minute. You're an evolutionist, right? What does more enlightened mean in evolutionary terms? This is like saying human beings are more advanced than cockroaches. Wait a minute. In evolutionary terms, there is no such thing as more advanced. We are more complicated biologically.
Different, maybe?
We can different, and I think you could talk about biologic complexity, but what you can't do is smuggle in some kind of value that we are somehow more advanced than cockroaches. What all evolution can choose for is survivability of selfish genes, to make reference to Richard Dawkins.
Right.
So in a certain sense, the cockroach has not evolved any better than we have, because we are all surviving equally well on this planet, and that is the only measure of Darwinian evolution.
Yes.
In fact, they've been doing pretty well for billions of years.
Yeah.
You know? So
Right.
one might say they've been doing a better job.
Right.
And we might be wiped off the planet through nuclear holocaust.
That's right.
But I guess the cockroaches will
They'll still be here. That's
yeah.
right.
So, but notice how this, and I talk about this in the chapter on the inside out tactic. Notice how people who hold a atheistic, naturalistic, physicalistic worldview, and most atheists are physicalists. Only the physical world exists. We gain knowledge then through empirical means like science. Michael Shermer is famous of saying, I used to be a Christian. I used to believe in God. Now I believe in science. Okay, false dichotomy, but nevertheless, science is what tells you what it's all about, because he's a physicalist. Okay, but notice when they stand on that ground, they end up, if you listen carefully, importing all kinds of things into their conversation that have no place in their worldview. They don't make sense in their worldview.
Yeah.
Like saying the God of the Old Testament is immoral. Okay, maybe the Hebrews evolved a different set of morality. You can't say our morality is improving. We're more enlightened. That makes no sense in naturalistic terms, because that requires some type of transcendent standard to measure it by.
Yes.
But why do they do this? And I'll tell you why they do this. And I mean, this is very simple to answer. They do it because, as Francis Schaeffer has pointed out, they actually are made in the image of God, and they have to live in God's world. And God's world is thick with morality. Even when people try to deny it, they can't get away from it. Dawkins famously, when he writes, this world is just the kind of world that you'd expect it to be. If there is no God, nothing but blind, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. You're probably familiar with the quote as well, oft quoted.
Yeah.
And then he goes off in the God delusion with this magnificently written paragraph, and it is actually kind of clever. You could put it to music. It's so well written about all the bad things the God of the Old Testament is, bang, bang. It's a whole paragraph.
Right.
And so Richard, Professor Dawkins, help me understand. You have these two things fighting each other. Why doesn't your mind explode?
Right.
Why isn't there any cognitive dissonance to what you've just said?
Right.
Why don't you just bite the bullet and stick with the statement that you made earlier, which is consistent with your worldview? Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, no good, no evil. So leave the God of the Old Testament and everybody else you disagree with alone with regards to objectivist moral categories that you use if you want to have intellectual integrity.
I think it's interesting too, Greg, because at bottom, and I know we completely agree on this, at bottom, they smuggle in a teleology into their naturalism, whether it's a moral teleology or, if you say, what's the purpose of lungs? They can't say that lungs or your heart or your brain has a purpose.
Made for anything.
It's not made for anything. It's just developed to do. They just do things. The sun just does things. The moon just does things.
Yeah.
But it's nature, our existence, morality, the universe is all imbibed with a teleology that is inescapable to such an extent that I'm sure you've seen in your atheist readings that you see the skeptics saying that there is an illusion of design or an appearance of design, but it's all illusory.
Yes, Richard Dawkins famously, his opening line of The Blind Watchmaker, biological is a complex realm, giving the appearance of having been designed for a purpose, but it's all an illusion. And on his take, natural selection working on genetic mutation, neo-Darwinism, is adequate to explain this. Now, it's not adequate to explain anything, hardly, and more people on his side of the ledger are acknowledging that. Now, they're not looking for God. I've known Stephen Meyer for over 30 years, and it's interesting. He says for the last 6 or 7 or 8 years, that whole discipline at the highest levels is in major disruption. Okay, the most difficult people he deals with now are not the atheist evolutionists, but are the Christian evolutionists or
yeah.
the young earthers,
Yeah.
and all the believers are beating up on him, but he's incredibly ironic in the midst of all of that.
Yeah, he
he's
is.
just a sensational guy, but nevertheless, it's odd the way the turn things have taken.
Right.
So that whole paradigm is in trouble, and the reason that they continue to make reference unconsciously, without even realizing it, to teleology in the universe is because there is teleology. Things
Right.
are made for other things.
Right.
They're made for certain purposes. And by the way, if they're not, the idea of what Nature Day, what do they call that day? Nature Day?
Earth Day.
Earth Day, yeah,
Yeah.
Earth Day. There's no sense that the most natural thing in the universe is death, is
Yeah.
non-life. We are unique
Right.
here. Why are we trying? And the loss of species going extinct. That's natural. Before human beings ever showed up, that was going on for millions and millions of years. So why are we interfering as human beings, as if human beings have a unique responsibility above all other creatures to maintain this precise balance of nature
Right.
that we're in right now? It implicitly affirms the unique role of human beings in nature,
Right.
which that's a biblical worldview, not a naturalist worldview.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you point out in the story of reality too, the idea that the skeptic or the unbeliever, when you're talking about the problem of evil specifically, that the world has gone astray or something's
Yes.
wrong with the world.
Something's wrong with the world. Everybody knows that.
This led C.S. Lewis to ask the question. I'm not sure which essay in which he does this. He's speaking about, now, when I was an atheist, I'd always thought that something was wrong with the world. And I'm paraphrasing, I may be missing it a little bit. But he said, well, why should I think that something has gone wrong with the universe on naturalism? This idea that something isn't the way it ought to be implies that there is a way that it ought to be.
Exactly right.
And we're not seeing that. We're seeing shadows and hints and tinctures of what it might have been or could have been or should have been. But for the atheist in a naturalistic worldview, this idea that the world is broken and should be this way, whether God exists or not, is still implying that the skeptic knows of this teleological standard, whether it's for morality or the universe in itself or design in biology or world systems, that the atheist must have a standard by which he's judging what design is. If you think this is an illusion of design, then what is your standard for design? If you think something's broken, what's your standard for how it would look like if you thought it would be fixed? And if God exists, well, how do you know the way in which God would have intended the universe to be?
Yeah. I sat next to a gentleman on an airplane quite a number of years ago because I mention that because the field itself has changed a lot. But at the time, he identified himself as a psychologist. I said, well, psychology is a good evidence for the existence of God. And he said, how so? And I said, well, in psychology, you are trying to move people towards mental health, right? So there's a teleology there. In other words, human beings were made for something. There's an optimal goal in view for human mental health, and you're moving them to. By the way, all health language is like that. Arm is broken. Well, that means it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And so we mend it so that it's no longer broken. So this is all implicit. At the time, he agreed with me. He said, I never thought about that. So there's my stone in his shoe. However, since then, that's all changed because psychology isn't about making you better. Psychology now is making you happy about the way you are and feel good about it,
Yeah.
And if you don't feel good, then we're going to find some way to make you feel better. If depression makes you feel bad, then we'll help you get out of your depression. Not because depression is unhealthy. And by the way, this goes to the gender issue and a whole bunch of homosexuality, all of these different things that were considered aberrant psychologically and no more. Even pederasty was is no longer considered aberrant, In fact, the DSM, which is the manual of psychological disorders that psychologists use, at one point a few years back, actually in their newer edition, put pederasty in as a sexual preference.
Oh my goodness.
Of course, the LGBTQ community came absolutely unglued and made them change it. Okay, but that just shows how much politics influences
absolutely.
the DSM on certain issues. But they didn't want to be compared at all. But why not? I mean, I can understand why they wouldn't want, but why not compare them together? If there is no natural teleology to human behavior, there's no rightness or wrongness. There's just whatever. and that would make sense on a purely naturalistic take of things, well, then why not just say it's a sexual preference, okay? You can't even say it's a bad sexual preference because there's no grounds by which to say that.
Right.
If good and bad are determined by individual feelings, which is basically the criterion in our culture now, then as long as it makes a person feel good, then it's good by the new definition.
Yes.
Subjectivistic definition, that is.
Right. Well, the whole underlying foundation of our Western society, even in non-Western societies, the idea of law. C.S. Lewis, I think it's in The Abolition of Man, where he's in the back in the index, he outlines the Tao, where he goes through the historical references of the similarities we find in cultures that have some kind of favorable leaning toward a legal system, or whether it's cultural or civic, that there is this teleological, it's kind of like a tactics conversation, that you go back and you find commonality in morality in other cultures over the years. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one thing that I think that your book really helped me to reaffirm, was that there are good things and good means by which we can all agree that are good, and that good tools to bring these conversations, atheists and Christians, together.
I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, there's a couple of thoughts I have. One of them is that C.S. Lewis identifies the content, but Francis Schaeffer makes an observation simply about the machinery, the moral machinery. He called it moral motions. All human beings go through moral motions. Now, that's formal, that's not material. We don't have all the substance there. He's not talking about that. He said just the fact that we do that, it has ramifications for worldview. Then Lewis comes along and adds another element, which, I mean, everybody knows it, but he does it for us and helps us out, that those moral motions have universal content to them because the moral laws are universal themselves. And this is why we have a capability, philosophers call it a moral intuition, that we can seize upon these things, moral common sense, if you will. Now, these are all, if using philosophic terminology, epistemic. In other words, we all know these things, and this is what Lewis is getting at. But we take it a step further. We're asking the question, not just how do we know these things, we're asking the question, where did these things that we know come from? What gives them legitimacy? Or to put it in other words, says who? Says who? And if there's no answer to that, then all of these moral motions we're going through they're just accidentally similar, and they're only subjective. They're just up to us or up to our cultures. What a lot of atheists will say is, well, we know what's right or wrong. How do you know? It's common sense. Oh, wait, that was the wrong question, Greg. It's not how do you know. You can know what the speed limit is on the street because there's a sign there. That's how you know. But that isn't what makes the law that you can only go 35 miles an hour in that street incumbent upon me. That comes from a government. Yeah. And if I just put a sign out there that said speed limit 25, no one would have to obey it. They could see it, but doesn't have the authority as the government. So here's the way I like to put it. You made reference to this before, because I think the concept of grounding is a little bit difficult for people to get. So I make the point, as you said, that everybody knows, no matter where they live or when they live, that something is wrong with the world. Things are not the way they're supposed to be, okay? But things can't be the way they're not supposed to be unless there is a way they are supposed to be. Okay, so that goes to the question of moral relativism. If there are no speed limits real, then there's no breaking of the speed limits. If morality is simply up to individuals, then there can't be any real breaking of morality, because real morality doesn't exist. But if there is a way, if the world is not the way it's supposed to be, that means there is a way it's supposed to be, but it also means that it can't be a way it's supposed to be unless there's a sposer. There's got to be someone above that sets the standard, which is broken when we complain about the problem of evil. And that's why in this new book I have two books, chapters on atheism, where I show answer some of the challenges and what's wrong with them, and some of them are coming up in Bogosian's book, and then I give some dialogues of how you can launch into conversations with provocative questions to help expose those flaws. Okay, but one of them, I mean, some of these have to do with this whole grounding issue. The chapter on evil, which comes next, I actually connect with the atheism chapters, okay? And the first I call distractions, atheism, distractions, atheism. I can't remember the next chapter. But then the third one is the evil, atheism's fatal flaw.
Provocative.
And of course, the point is, and many people realize this, but it hasn't come together for them in this sense. If there is real evil in the world, there has to be real morality, and for there to be real objective morality, there has to be a moral lawgiver. Okay, that is just the moral argument for the existence of God, but it is the only option available realistically for objective evil. Some people want to go to moral Platonism, but there's a number of reasons that doesn't work at all. You've got to have a moral lawgiver, and the choice that the atheists virtually always opt for is for the Darwinian model, but that can't give you objective morality.
No.
If it works, which I don't even think it works, on the merits, it can only give you subjective morality. It can't ground the problem of evil. So it turns out that the problem of evil is not a good argument against the existence of God. It's one of the best arguments for the existence.
I agree, as difficult as it is. I've had in many conversations with skeptic friends the idea of evil. Oftentimes when it's brought up, if I bring it up, they'll want to change. They don't want to talk about the word evil. There's too many connotations with it. They want to talk about human flourishing. But that doesn't address the question either, because you're still operating on a teleological standard of what it means for a human being to flourish in the first place.
Absolutely. That's Sam Harris's approach.
Yeah.
Human flourishing, morality. But what he says is we all agree that morality is about human flourishing. Okay, stop. First of all, you're smuggling in a moral good right at the very beginning of trying to explain morality.
Right.
Okay. Secondly, what does flourishing look like? That depends on your worldview. In the Third Reich, they had a different idea of what human flourishing. Read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Okay. Shearer's book, I finished it earlier this year, and there's a whole chapter in there of what Hitler intended to do if he won the war, and what Europe and the Soviet, at least the eastern portion of the Soviet Union, would look like. This is not a pretty picture, but what was it for? It was Lebensraum. It was extending to have living space for the Germans so the Volk could flourish. Well, that's a view of human flourishing. And the Jews would be gone and the other Slavs would be slave labor. Boy, that's good for the Germans. We got a lot more room to spread out in. We've got a lot more place to plant our crops. We got the Ukraine. We got the oil in the Balkans. We got all of this stuff that we can make use of. Wow, we're doing fine. We're flourishing.
Right.
Okay. The whole notion of flourishing is tied to worldview. It isn't just out there, and it is considered an objective moral good for which Sam Harris has no grounding whatsoever. He's cheating, is what he's doing.
Right. Well, it reminds me. You bring up Nazi Germany. It reminds me. It's a fantastic book, and it's a great movie too. George Clooney, Monuments Men, where Hitler was on this lesser-known idea of collecting all the world's great art and using it for his museum. But the story goes during World War II, as the Third Reich was in decline and not going to come out of it. The Americans sent together some art historians and some specialists who went around the world and were uncovering all these wonderful works of art that the Nazis had hid in caves and salt mines, recovering the treasures of Western civilization from the grip of the Nazis. And I thought it was a wonderful metaphor parallel, kind of what you're talking about here, that Christians, as gardeners, are continually trying to preserve, like museums. We are trying to recover and preserve those truths, those tenets of our civilization. Not just this is not just a verbal philosophical argument game, but this is literally a search and rescue and recovery, and kind of what's the right word? We're passing on to generations the truths that have been handed down to us. Stewards, if you will. We bring stewardship.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. I just thought of another little angle to that. Most of this artwork was stolen from Jews.
That's right.
And so the glorious thing that is being discovered had been the ownership of the Jews, which is the same thing that we're talking. What had been entrusted to the nation of Jews, now the blessing of Abraham to all nations.
So we are monuments men as believers, I think.
That's right.
In some
nice
sense.
way of putting it.
Yeah. I wanted to close with this, and I know you've been more than generous with your time today, and I just had this final thought. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Sure,
this comes from Paul Davies, who's a secular physicist. The Mind of God, I'm sure you know who Davies is. He's often quoted by apologists and Christians a lot.
Did Davies become a Christian? I'm trying to remember.
I've heard people say. He's awfully close in his books. He seems very concessional. But then it was a couple of years ago on Closer to Truth with Robert Kuhn. He said, "No, I'm not. I'm not a theist." But I don't know. Today, maybe he's changed his mind.
Well, in Stephen Meyer's new book, "The Return of the God Hypothesis," he does talk about a number of those people just based on the powerful evidence from physics and astronomy. They have become theists, and some have become Christians. And some of these well-known people, and Paul Davies, of course, is one of the biggest names in astrophysics and astronomy.
Yeah. We have, I don't know if you know who Sarah Salviander is. We have a book, The Story of the Cosmos, that I helped edit and put together 3 years ago. Good Sarah was an astrophysicist as an atheist in graduate school for her degree. Came to Christ over time, but it was through her study of astrophysics and black holes that led her to Christ. And so God uses everything to draw people closer to Him. But I wanted to have some of your closing thoughts on what Davey says here, because I think it reminds me of the effectiveness of tactics and pebble in the shoe methodologies, because we're just taking some ideas from the culture, again, recovering what was rightly entrusted to the Jewish people. And that is, and certainly includes creation, because Moses starts off with a whole treatise on creation. In the beginning, God created everything. But Davies says, through science, we as human beings are able to grasp at least some of nature's secrets. We have cracked part of the cosmic code. Why this should be, just why Homo sapiens should carry the spark of rationality that provides the key to the universe, is a deep enigma. And this is coming from he was writing as a non-theist in that regard. And I think that's a fantastic pebble in the shoe.
Yes, it is. And he's asking the question, of course, but there are not very many coherent answers to that. Certainly not in a naturalistic worldview. Now, what this reminds me a little bit of Jay Richards and Guillermo Gonzalez books, The Privileged Planet, and part of what they recognize in that, it's about the teleology of the universe, but how the planet Earth is in such a peculiar place, and our moon is such that it's possible to have a perfect solar eclipse. Now, what happens with a perfect solar eclipse is that and this only happens with the right size moon at the right distance from the sun. From the Earth, to perfect, so that all that's left is the corona, and you're able then to see things in outer space and about the sun that you would not be able to see. And that's why he calls it privileged planet. And it just seems like, and he gave a lot more reasons, that we are in this privileged place of observation. And Richard Dawkins would say we just got lucky, which is what that's his answer to the fine tuning arguments. But I think we've got a better answer to that than that we just got lucky. And I think this is what Paul Davies is getting at. There's someone else who made a similar comment. I always forget his name, but the standard Big Bang model was Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. Thank you. You got to come on tour with me, So
I'll be happy to. That'd be wonderful.
Roger Penrose was making observations about the nature of mathematics, and he said, "Isn't it amazing that mathematics exists? Because math is not physical; it manifests itself in the physical world, but math is a reality that is not physical. These are abstract concepts, and that they are there. Okay, that's the first amazement, that math exists. Second amazement is that human minds have the capability of discovering that immaterial, abstract world.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Third amazing thing is that world that they discover that's immaterial and abstract has imprinted itself on the physical world. Mm-hmm. And therefore, human beings can use the abstract realm of mathematics to learn about how the world works.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so the world is, in a certain sense, the physical realm is beholden to the non-physical realm. Now, I just heard him. I don't know where I heard it actually, but maybe Bill Craig put it on one of his podcasts and played it. I don't know, William Lane Craig. And I thought about that, and I don't know what his spiritual convictions are, but how can a person who acknowledges those three things remain a physicalist or
it's
even
kind
a
of hard,
naturalist?
right? Because the mind, Alexander Vilenkin, who's a Russian cosmologist, he has written that he concedes that if mind is the conduit of mathematics, does that mean that mind preceded the universe? Because he can't, and I think it's even Penrose in a recent conversation on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley, it was a couple of years ago, Penrose conceded to a kind of Platonic realm for mathematics, that he wouldn't go to God, but he says, yes, mathematics have some kind of independent existence that we didn't create, we more or less discovered that. And this is Eugene Wigner's argument in his essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics, and I don't think Wigner was a theist, but he encapsulates this idea of what an enigma, what a wonder of math, that we should be thankful for it. I mean, look at how we speak of the universe in these terms. And then it was, I don't know if you've ever heard the cartoon of Donald Duck in Mathmagic Land.
I haven't.
It's an old Disney one. I think you can get it on YouTube. You should watch the end of it, because this is back in the days, I think this is 50s Disney, that they conclude the whole thing with a Galileo quote. Mathematics is the language that God used to create the universe. That's on a Disney cartoon with Donald Duck. But it's
Not anymore.
It's a wonderful cartoon about what you've just said in terms of mathematics. If you don't know anything about mathematics, Disney has Donald Duck going through all these adventures in time about how math was discovered from the Pythagoreans till the present day.
Right.
But it is an enigmatic aspect of the universe. It's like the atheist argument, I'm sure you've heard, where people say, well, we wouldn't be here talking about these constants and quantities if they weren't this way, so we don't have to worry about fine-tuning. But that's like saying we wouldn't be talking about the beauty and the magnificence of this house we live in if we didn't live in it.
Right.
But that doesn't explain why the house is here. That doesn't get rid of that tension.
Exactly right. That's the anthropic principle, and this is the exit for many, given the obviously fine-tuned elements of the universe. It doesn't explain anything. It only explains why we are wondering about it.
Right.
It doesn't explain why it's here. It's well put.
Excellent.
You tossed a word in there from one of these authors who is reflecting on the mathematical universe. We ought to be thankful for it.
Yeah, that's Wigner, right?
Yeah, okay. Now, but think of thankfulness. Thanks doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are thankful for things because we are thankful to someone who gave it.
Right.
It doesn't make sense to give thanks to no one.
Right. Your thanks goes unrequited in a materialistic universe. Nobody's listening to it.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
of course. But that, to me, is another evidence. If we feel the impulse to be thankful, it is because there are good things to be thankful for, and there is someone who is responsible for the good things to whom we give thanks.
Right.
So even in the concept of giving thanks, there's a teleology built in.
Absolutely. Abraham Lincoln recognized it and made it a holiday.
That's right. There you go.
You don't have but that's the conundrum of, I think, a lot of atheists that I know still like Thanksgiving and Christmas, but there's no Christ and there's no one to whom they can give thanks. But they like the trimmings of it, but they don't like the connotations that ground these things. And I think that's kind of where we are as a culture, and to some extent that when we engage our post-Christian or non-Christian culture, however you want to classify it, I do think that your books and your insights, Greg, are much needed. We need to structure our conversations in a way that is, without changing the message, we can play around with methodologies all we want to, but as you said earlier in our conversation, there's a mental furniture to which we need to acclimate ourselves in the minds of people that haven't grown up, like generations haven't grown up in a theistic worldview or a Western idea, or they're just devoid of everything. It would be hard for them to read a Francis Schaeffer book because he deals so much with the past, and people aren't reading books. And so I think tactics and...
They even have a hard time with C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, which amazes me.
Yeah, so. And I was a high school, middle school teacher, and I was passionate about trying to get the kids to read. Just read. Tolle loge, or whatever, I think Augustine's phrase, pick it up and read, this idea that led him to Christ.
That's right.
That we need to engender for us as Christians, we need to really work on our language and really understanding the mental furniture of our unbelieving neighbors in a way that is a gardening kind of way that honors Christ.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that. I want to encourage. I was in very far eastern North Carolina, right by the coast, and it was very, very rural. And during a Q&A after teaching tactics, a dear man asked, "Well, how? This all sounds so complicated. How do we get better at this?" And he was a little discouraged, I guess, or just wondering, how can I wade into this? I said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a hog farmer." I said, "Okay, when you started hog farming, what'd you know? You didn't know hardly anything. What you started to do is started farming hogs, and then you learned a little more, and then you got better at it. And if you and I walked into a pig pen, I'd see a bunch of dirty pigs. You'd see all kinds of things that I didn't see because you've had these years of working with hogs. Okay, the exact same thing applies here. And I encourage people with regards to the tactics book, especially the first 2 steps of the 3-part game plan. You're always in the shallow end of the pool. You're ankle deep. There's no threat. There's no difficulty. There's no hardship. It's not hard to do. It's easy to get started. And once you get started, you're going to see amazing things happen as God begins to work through the gardening that you're able to do with these tools in the tactics book.
And I think if I can make it one takeaway from people that I can't believe that there might be, well, there must be, because I didn't know anything about this. I mean, I knew about who you were. I knew what tactics was. I just had never read the book. And as I'm listening to you read it, which is wonderful, just alone, I would say thank you for being the guy who read the book, because it's so cool to have the author reading his own work. I love that. But
I listened to the earlier version. Somebody else read it. And there's just nothing like an author to know what he means.
It wasn't like an audio book. It was like an interview. It was like you were very passionate and personal and conversational. But I think the big thing that I took away, because I was going up to Utah to engage Mormons in their territory, so I'm going to go turn around and apply these kinds of things. But like I said at the beginning of our talk, it really took the pressure off of me and gave me some confidence in terms of, okay, that's really a creative and an obvious way. But you're not, I mean, you are saying things that are kind of novel, but you're basing them on things that have been around a long time. You have found some treasure, things that have been entrusted to the Jews, and you've brought them forth and said, look at what you have in Christ. Look at what you can do. Look how God has equipped you to be a gardener. And you make the point, I liked too, that we didn't really talk about it, but you did allude to it a little bit, that most of us are gardeners, and there are few harvesters. And because harvesting kind of fruit falls into your lap in some sense.
That's right. Harvest is easy when the fruit is ripe.
Yeah. So a very accessible book, a very encouraging book. Congratulations on it having so much widespread success, Greg.
Thank you, Dan.
I highly recommend to our audience, if you haven't experienced Greg's book, get the Audible and listen to it. And Greg is a wonderful teacher. You feel like you're getting a class lecture from you. It's personal and it's wonderful, and you embody. I know I'm just being sloppy about this, but you embody the incarnate way in which I think good teaching, you make it personal, and I think that's important too. And I think it's an encouragement to think that we're not just talking to robots, pushing buttons and doing X, Y, and Z to get to A, B, and C. We are engaging with human beings, and it's a case by case. But you have given us some great tools for the body, Greg. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do. And Dan, it's been a real treat talking with you. We're kindred spirits.
Yeah.
It's great to be able to just connect and knock things around that really matter and have an audience that cares about this stuff too. Thank you.